Requia aeternam dona ei, Domine, et lus perpetua luceat ei.
For king and country.
Hey guys, tonight we're going to step into a story so horrifying and dark that it's buried within the pages of history. A story few dare to tell in its entirety. We'll unveil the gruesome end of a king once hailed as Europe's most handsome prince, King Henry VIII. Forget the majestic portraits and romanticized films you've seen. Instead, imagine a deformed body, a stench so nauseating it could make anyone faint, and an unceasing, tormenting pain. This is the tale of his final days, a journey from the peak of power to an abyss of decay and madness, where not even death could erase the indignity. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find what I do here interesting. Feel free to share your thoughts on this topic in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Begin by closing your eyes and imagining the soft candlelight flickering across the ancient stone walls of a grand palace, as we drift into the story of a boy born long ago. On the 28th of June in the year 1491, a child arrived in the world, the youngest son of King Henry VII and Queen Elizabeth of York. Even as a lad, he carried himself with an air of quiet confidence, though he had not yet known the weight of a crown. When fate led him to ascend the throne at the tender age of 17, the kingdom paused to marvel at the prince who now became king. Tall and athletic, with burnished red-gold hair that caught every glimmer of the sun, he moved through the court like a figure from a dream, head held high, shoulders squared. A Venetian ambassador, moved by what he saw, described him as possessing an extraordinary figure and angelic countenance, surpassing any other Christian prince in beauty and presence. In those early years of his reign, he wore the trappings of royalty with ease. Silk banners fluttered overhead as foreign dignitaries arrived to pay their respects. Sumptuous feasts lined the long tables of his banquets. Trumpets sounded to announce each new dignitary's arrival. Yet even amidst this pageantry, a hush would fall when he entered, for his reputation for charm and strength preceded him, comforting some and sending a gentle thrill through others. He was the epitome of regal authority, a living symbol of England's grandeur, and it seemed as if nothing could touch that shining veneer. But time moves on, as quietly and insidiously as dew collecting on the petals of a rose, and on a cold January day in the year 1536, when he had reached the age of 44, a shadow fell over the king's vitality. At a jousting tournament in Greenwich, he perched high atop his armoured steed, lance poised with practised grace. Then, without warning, the horse collapsed beneath him, and the king tumbled heavily to the frozen turf. He lay unconscious for 2 hours, the world around him fading to grey. Though he survived this terrible fall, the injury to his right leg never fully mended. The wound became an ulcer, ever open and oozing, filling the air with a fetid odour that followed him like an invisible cloak. Imagine the court's uneasy silence as he moved from chamber to chamber, each step accompanied by a faint but unmistakable stench. Courtiers dared not wrinkle their noses or breathe too deeply, for any display of revulsion risked the king's unpredictable wrath. They endured in stoic obedience, their loyalty tempered by a quiet dread. It was during this same sorrowful period that he presided over the trial and execution of his second wife, Anne Boleyn, on charges of adultery and treason accusations that many historians now believe were fabricated. The accident in Greenwich, some suggest, may have shaken more than his bones. Perhaps it unsettled his mind as well. Where once he had been confident and regal, now he grew prone to sudden fits of anger and suspicion, his temperament darkening like a sky laden with storm clouds. As the months passed, his body, already weakened by pain, began a slow, inexorable decline. Once measuring a trim 35-inch waist about 89 centimetres, he saw that measurement swell beyond 51 inches, surpassing 130 centimetres. He tipped the scales at over 180 kilograms, so vast in girth that palace artisans fashioned a system of pulleys and ropes to transport him between his apartments. Doorways were widened, chairs were reinforced, and the court learned to accommodate his size with careful whispers and furtive glances. Meanwhile, his appetite remained insatiable. Royal records tell of days when he consumed some 5,000 calories, feasting on succulent cuts of red meat, meat pies abundant and rich, and astonishing volumes of wine and ale, while vegetables, those humble greens, were nearly forgotten. Coupled with his newfound yet reluctant immobility, this lavish diet hastened his decline, leaving his frame heavy and sluggish, the ulcer on his leg growing ever more foul. Yet despite this creeping decay, the rituals of monarchy trudged on. He continued to receive foreign envoys beneath the gilded ceilings of the throne room, to preside over councils debating alliances with France and Spain, and to sponsor lavish pageants meant to remind the world of his undisputed power. Each ceremony shone with polished splendor. Each war council bristled with strategy. But behind the splendor lay the hollow echo of a king whose body and spirit were slowly eroding. And so, dear listener, as you drift towards sleep, picture Henry VIII in his velvet robes and gold chain, once a beacon of youthful vigor, now carried through castle corridors by ropes and pulleys, his eyes shadowed, his strength waning, the twilight of his reign ushering in a melancholy tale of a mighty monarch brought low by the inevitable passage of time. Imagine now a slow, heavy sigh drifting through the corridors of the palace, as we linger on the aftermath of that cruel fall. The ulcer upon King Henry's right leg was no mere wound, but a relentless furnace of agony and humiliation. Each breath of air seemed poisoned by its foul stench, a rank odour so overwhelming that the servants dared not inhale deeply, fearing that even a single twitch of revulsion might draw the king's wrath. The physicians of the day, armed with ignorance and crude tools, applied treatments that only deepened his torment. They seared the sore with iron rods heated until they glowed like embers, attempting to cauterize what lay beneath. Yet each touch sent a fresh wave of burning pain through his already broken spirit. They smeared arsenic and mercury pastes into the festering flesh, believing that poison would conquer poison, while also draining his strength. And in their misguided zeal, they performed regular bloodletting, opening his veins to let life flow out like water from a cracked urn. These remedies, intended to heal, instead fed the ulcer's unholy appetite. Flesh decayed, bone emerged like bleached ivory beneath rotting tissue, and pus seeped in slow, shimmering rivulets that stained linen sheets. The inner sanctum of the palace, once a haven of velvet carpets and gilt-framed tapestries, became a silent chamber of suffering, where courtiers tiptoed in hushed dread, as if a terrible spectre had taken residence. By the year 1540, as the chill of winter lay upon the windows, the king sought solace in marriage once more. His fifth queen, Catherine Howard, arrived at court in the bloom of youth, just 19 summers old, with hair like spun gold and a smile bright enough to lift weary hearts. Henry, desperate for a spark of vitality, hoped that her youth might rekindle his own flickering flame. Yet the reality was far more harrowing. The same odour that offended the noses of noblemen and ladies at dinner filled every corner of his bedchamber. His once proud frame, now swollen and distorted, dwarfed the slim figure of Catherine beside him. The young queen found herself trapped in a nightmare of stench and decay, her dreams turning quickly to dread. Before long, Catherine's heart sought comfort beyond the cold embrace of her husband's bed. She fell into an illicit affair with a courtier of gentle manners, whose presence offered her fleeting relief from the suffocating gloom. Rumours whispered through corridors like autumn leaves rustling on stone floors, until the scandal could no longer be contained. When the truth reached Henry's ears, his anger erupted in a storm of retribution. He condemned Catherine and her lover to the block with chilling swiftness, their blood staining the very boards upon which they once danced. Thus ended one of the court's most tragic and reviled dramas, a spectacle that left hearts heavy with sorrow and dread. A mere 3 years later, in 1543, the king chose a sixth bride, Catherine Parr, a widow known more for her gentle intelligence than for courtly splendour. Their union was born of politics more than passion, a calculated match to secure alliances and maintain stability. Yet Catherine's role transcended that of a mere queen. She became his nurse and confidant, tending to his ravaged body with patient hands and unwavering compassion. By lamplight, She administered salves of freshly foraged herbs, braided small wreaths of lavender and rosemary to mask the stench, and read to him from comforting scriptures in the hope of easing his restless mind. She navigated the treacherous waters of factional intrigue with quiet grace, forging ties across rival camps while keeping a wary eye upon the king's unpredictable moods. In those long, sleepless nights, her gentle voice was perhaps the only balm for his fevered dreams. During these final years, Henry VIII bore the weight of many chronic ailments. He suffered from the ravages of diabetes, his blood sugar rising and falling like tides against a stone shore. He endured the merciless agony of gout, each crystalline deposition within his joints a sore reminder of his mortality. Hypertension tightened its grip upon his weary heart, and whispers among court physicians spoke of a failing cardiac strength that no tonic could restore. Some historians have speculated that syphilis, its evidence lost to time, may have played a part, though credible proof remains elusive. Together, these afflictions conspired to warp his mind as surely as they ravaged his flesh, weaving a tapestry of paranoia and despair that left him prone to sudden outbursts or long, immobile silence. His temperament swayed between extremes, as if pulled by unseen tides. In one moment, he would roar commands that rattled the very windows, his voice echoing through the vaulted halls like thunder. In the next, he would lie motionless, his gaze vacant, as though the world outside his chamber walls had ceased to exist. Courtiers approached at their peril, uncertain whether their king would greet them with a sharp rebuke or remain mute, lost within his own turbulent thoughts. His punishments for perceived slights were swift and merciless, a stark contrast to the warmth he might once have shown. And so the twilight of Henry VIII's life unfurled, a tapestry woven of pain, regret, and unfulfilled longing. The mighty monarch, once the embodiment of vigour and royal splendour, was now but a fragile vessel, buffeted by the storms of disease and the shadows of his own mind. As you drift toward the gentle embrace of slumber, let the memory of his final years remind you of the fragile nature of our mortal frame, and perhaps allow your own breath to slow as the palace doors close softly on the troubled dreams of a king who gave everything, only to find that time and fate are forces no crown can command. Years passed, and the once robust monarch had become a living testament to the tragedy that can unfold when a mind and body are assailed by relentless suffering. In the stillness of his later years, Henry VIII found himself besieged by the cruel legacy of that fateful fall, when the jousting tilt at Greenwich had sent him crashing to the ground. What seemed at first merely a grievous injury soon blossomed into a crescendo of maladies that overtook him like a gathering storm. Severe attacks of gout plagued his joints, each step sending jolts of burning pain up his legs, forcing him to lean upon attendants, as though he were a child, learning to walk for the very first time. Even the slightest movement could bring tears to his eyes, and through velvet-lined corridors, the echo of his laboured breathing followed him like an unwilling companion. Beneath it all lay that festering ulcer upon his right leg, a wound that would not cease its slow betrayal. It exuded a stench so rank that courtiers dared only whisper of it behind closed doors, and yet they endured, their knuckles white around the hilt of their daggers and the length of their spoons. Doctors of the day, armed with instruments as crude as the knowledge they wielded, treated the king's suffering with cauterizing irons that glowed red-hot, their heat meant to seal flesh, but instead driving agony deeper into his very bones. They anointed the ulcer with paste made from arsenic and mercury, believing poison to repel poison, all the while draining his strength with regular bloodletting. Such treatments, conceived in an era when science was still but a flickering candle against the dark, only fed the wound's dreadful appetite. Flecks of bone began to show through the rotting tissue, and each breath seemed tainted by a miasma that clung to the king's gait. Modern scholars, peering back through the haze of centuries, now speculate that Henry may have suffered mild strokes, each one a thief in the night that robbed him of a measure of his reason. These silent invasions upon the brain likely left him more prone to suspicion and rage, his moods oscillating like a ship at the mercy of an unrelenting sea. Paranoia crept into his thoughts like an uninvited guest, whispering falsehoods that no loyal servant could dispel. At the slightest perceived betrayal, he would lash out. The Duke of Norfolk, once a trusted ally, met his end on the scaffold, his guilt presumed, but never proven. Thomas Cromwell, that masterful architect of the Reformation, fell victim to a similar fate, one day a counsellor of the sovereign, the next a traitor condemned to die. The court itself became a realm of trepidation, where furtive glances were deemed treasonous, and the softest footstep in the hall might draw a summons to the block. To guard against the threat of poison, whether conjured by real enemies or merely born of his suspicious mind, Henry devised an elaborate system of culinary security. Each dish presented at his table was preceded by an ordeal for his most trusted servants, who were compelled to taste each morsel, each crumb, and even each sweetmeat, before it could be laid before the king. Their tongues danced at the edge of peril, knowing that a single misstep might condemn them to a slow, agonizing death. The plates and goblets themselves were subjected to methodical cleansing rituals, their surfaces scrubbed and scoured until they shone like polished mirrors. Some whispered that the process became so obsessive that the king's meals were colder than the stones in his chambers, but to Henry, the price of safety outweighed the need for warmth. And yet, beneath this veneer of precision, there lay a profound loneliness, an isolation that no guard of steel nor league of sworn bodyguards could remedy. Meanwhile, the machinery of European geopolitics continued its ceaseless turning. Henry, that master of shifting alliances, navigated the courts of France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire with the deftness of a seasoned mariner steering between shoals. He would court one power, pledging favour and pardon, only to turn and clasp hands with another, binding himself to disparate treaties as though they were strands in a tapestry too grand to behold at a glance. Such diplomatic artistry kept England on an ever-precarious pedestal, a balance of influence that ministers extolled in gold-leaf proclamations, even as the royal coffers echoed with emptiness. The cost of war, the upkeep of castles, and the constant flow of sumptuous banquets drained the kingdom's treasure as though it were a bottomless vessel. And so feasts were laid with platters piled high, swans roasted golden, pheasants dressed in silver trappings, and goblets overflowing with rich red wines imported from the sun-baked vineyards of France. Each banquet hall reverberated with music and laughter, but behind the velvet draperies lay the shadow of a king enmeshed in his own suffering. Yet even in these dark days, Henry VIII's patronage bore a rare blossom of beauty in the realm of the arts. His court became a haven for gifted musicians and painters whose talents flourished under his auspices. Thomas Tallis and William Byrd composed sacred polyphony, whose harmonies rose like incense in the chapels of Street, George's and Westminster Abbey, their voices intertwining in complex melodies that seemed to echo the very machinery of the heavens. Hans Holbein the Younger, with his unrivaled skill for capturing a likeness, painted portrait after portrait of the royal family and courtiers, his brush revealing not only the faces but the fragile souls that lay behind each regal countenance. Lucas Cranach, too, lent his gifts, leaving behind images that glimmered with colour even as he hinted at the inner turmoil of his sitters. These artistic endeavours, bright candles in a long night, laid the groundwork for the cultural resurgence that would shine most brilliantly under Elizabeth's reign. Though Henry's hands were too feeble to hold a quill for much longer, and his ears too dulled by illness to savour every note, he found solace in knowing that beauty, once sown, might bloom anew. The strains of polyphonic choirs and the glint of painted jewels in canvas would become the inheritance of a nation reborn from the ashes of its own transformation. So, as you nestle beneath your covers and feel the quiet pull of sleep, let the memory of Henry VIII's paradoxical twilight linger softly. Recall the king who once strode across Europe as a paragon of power, now humbled by injuries and ailments no earthly throne could defy. Remember the meals tasted by trembling hands, the alliances brokered in candlelit chambers, and the vibrant harmonies that rose above the din of politics and pain. In these threads, you may find the gentle reminder that even the harshest trials can give rise to unexpected beauty, and that in the hush between each one, a measure of peace awaits. In the closing chapter of his life, Henry VIII endured a ceaseless procession of suffering that seemed to bear down upon him like a storm with no end. The once mighty sovereign, whose laughter once echoed through the vaulted halls of the palace, now lay confined to his deathbed, racked by fevers that flared and subsided in cruel cycles. These were no ordinary fevers, but the wrath of septic infections born of his festering leg ulcer, an open wound that refused to heal and festered with every passing day. As pus gathered like stagnant water and the skin around it turned dark and brittle, his body rebelled against itself, drawing on his strength, until he could no longer lift even an arm without drawing a gasp of pain. In those final days, Henry's movements became impossibly slow. To turn his head felt like wrestling against a weight heavier than the crown he once wore so proudly. He required the devoted care of his last queen, Catherine Parr, whose gentle hands bathed and dressed his wounds by the dim glow of candlelight. She applied salves of lavender and rosemary herbs plucked from the garden at twilight, in a humble attempt to mask the rancid odour that clung to his chambers like a shroud. When delirium swept over him, he mumbled the names of wives long gone: Jane Seymour, whose memory lingered soft and wistful; Anne Boleyn, whose spectre seemed to haunt his fevered dreams with accusations unspoken. In his mutterings, one could hear the tremor of guilt, as though the deeds of the past pressed upon his heart as heavily as the stagnant air around him. Paranoia, that ever-present spectre in the palace, rose to an unbearable crescendo. Fearful whispers spoke of plots to poison his wine or smuggle a dagger into his chamber, and so he ordered the most draconian measures of security ever seen at court. Foot soldiers stood guard in every corridor, muskets at the ready, even in the hushed hours before dawn. Gentlemen of the Privy Chamber dared not exchange even a fleeting glance with their sovereign, lest he interpret the slightest hesitation as treachery. Courtiers bowed as though rooted to the floor, their voices hushed to mere breaths, for uttering the word death in the presence of the dying king was itself considered a capital offence. Thus, even as the stench of decay crept beyond the palace walls, mingling with the damp air of winter, no soul dared speak plainly of the inevitable. On the 27th of January, in the year 1547, when the candle of his life burned but a flicker, Henry at last summoned Archbishop Thomas Cranmer to his bedside. The agony in his eyes spoke volumes. He could no longer shape his lips into words. And so, when the Archbishop asked if he departed this world in the comfort of the Catholic faith he had once redefined, the king's fingers closed around Cranmer's hand in a final, resolute grip, a wordless testament to the devotion that still stirred within his battered soul. Those clutching fingers, pale and thin as parchment, bore the echoes of battles fought for faith, nation, and crown. Shortly after midnight, on the 28th of January, Henry VIII breathed his last at 55 years of age, his reign of 38 years ending not amid fanfare, but in the hushed vigil of a bedchamber, heavy with sorrow. Yet death did not grant him the dignity he had so fiercely defended in life. His prodigious bulk required a coffin, crafted by the kingdom's finest carpenters, a box so large and unwieldy it threatened to collapse beneath its own weight. The embalming process of the time, little more than gutting the body of its organs and filling the void with aromatic herbs, proved insufficient to contain the forces of decomposition that churned within. As days passed and the cortege awaited the rite of state funeral, gases swelled within the coffin, forcing seams apart and allowing fetid liquids to seep through the gaps. At night, in the stillness of the chapel at Can Abbey, stray dogs crept in through cracks in the door and lapped at the oozing fluids, drawn by a stench that no length of cherished incense could disguise. Chroniclers later recorded the sight with shuddering dismay. The same sovereign who had defied the Pope, torn a nation from Rome, and presided over courts of power, now lay violated by hungry beasts. The ground around his coffin bore the footprints of hounds, rather than the polished boots of dignitaries. It was perhaps the most ignominious chapter in an otherwise monumental life. The state funeral was finally held on the 16th of February, nearly 3 weeks after his passing, within the vaulted expanse of St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. The air, still stale with the memory of rot, hosted a procession of mourners dressed in sable robes that rustled like sombre leaves. Peeresses and ambassadors, knights and squire, all walked in stately silence behind the bier, their faces grave, their eyes shaded by veils of black. Incense smoke curled in the chilly air, striving in vain to banish the memory of the stench that lingered in every corner. Henry VIII was interred alongside Jane Seymour, the queen who had granted him his only legitimate son, the boy destined to inherit a kingdom riven by his father's deeds. And so, with the final tolling of bells, the king's battered body was laid to rest. Yet even in death he could not escape the shadow of his own enormity. As you drift toward the gentle oblivion of sleep, imagine the echoes of that funeral march fading into the hush of winter winds. Reflect upon a monarch whose ambition remade a nation, whose victories and vices intertwined to shape the course of history. In Henry's End, we glimpse the fragile boundary between power and mortality, a reminder that no crown, however gilded, can shield a human heart from the inexorable decay of flesh and the quiet reckoning of conscience. Let these thoughts guide you into dreams, where even the most turbulent rains may find peaceful closure in the stillness of the night. The state funeral of Henry VIII commenced on the 16th of February in the year 1547 at St. George's Chapel within the ancient walls of Windsor Castle. From dawn's pale light, torches burned in iron sconces, casting a golden glow upon rows of mourners clad in sable robes edged with velvet. The choir's dirge-like chants reverberated beneath the vaulted ceiling, each note slipping softly into the hush that fell over the congregation. Despite the solemn pageantry knights in gleaming armour, banners emblazoned with Tudor emblems, and trumpeters sounding royal fanfares, an undercurrent of unease permeated the air. For though the coffin lay draped in rich purple cloth and crowned with wreaths of white lilies, the persistent odour of decay still lingered. Courtiers discreetly lifted perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces, seeking to ward off the faint but unmistakable stench that clung stubbornly to the linens. Even as prayers echoed through the hallowed nave, one could not fully escape the memory of the fluids that had leaked from the coffin days before, devoured by stray dogs in that ignominious scene at the abbey. Yet the ritual pressed on. Incense wafted toward the high vault, and pallbearers, faces grave with duty, guided the king's remains into their final resting place, beside Jane Seymour, the gentle queen who had borne him his only legitimate son, Edward VI. Thus concluded the chapter of Henry's reign. A life of grandeur and reform, now sealed in the stillness of stone and shadow. Almost immediately after the funeral cortege dispersed, the young Edward ascended the throne under the regency of the Duke of Somerset. Edward VI, a boy of but 9 years, inherited a realm transformed by his father's bold decrees, the dissolution of the monasteries, the break with Rome, and the rise of the Church of England. Though his tutors guided his education in theology and statecraft, the weight of sovereign power bore heavily upon his shoulders. He reigned for 6 brief years, a span that seemed both fleeting and eternal to those who watched him grow. Under his rule, Protestant reforms deepened, yet his fragile health was no match for the burdens of kingship. By his 15th summer, he succumbed to illness, likely a fever that swept through the palace like a silent spectre, bringing his life and reign to an untimely end. His passing opened the door to fresh turmoil, as courtiers and clergy alike vied for control of the young king's legacy and the soul of the nation. Though Edward's intentions were earnestly guided by piety and learning, he was but a child caught in the currents of history, drifting toward a shore he never reached. In the wake of Edward's demise, Mary Tudor claimed the crown with steely resolve and a heart set upon restoring Catholic rights. She was proclaimed queen amidst cheers and cries of "God save our sovereign lady." Yet her zeal for Rome's ancient liturgies soon curdled into something far darker. Mary's ardent devotion drove her to reverse her brother's Protestant measures, and those who refused to kneel at the altar in their old faith found themselves branded as heretics. Thus began the era now remembered as the reign of Bloody Mary, a time marked by the burning of nearly 300 souls at the stake. Clergymen, scholars, and laypeople alike trembled beneath her uncompromising hand, as the smell of smouldering wood mingled with the frozen air of autumn days. Her leadership, though sincere in its conviction, plunged the kingdom into fear and despair, fracturing families and fracturing hearts. Yet amidst the smoke and tears, Mary clung to her vision of spiritual unity, believing that her actions, however severe, would secure England's place within the fold of true Christianity. When Mary's candle burnt low and her own health faltered, it was Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, who took the throne and ushered in what would become the Golden Age of England. Elizabeth I, though once the subject of courtly intrigue, now stood as a monarch both resolute and radiant. She restored the Church of England with a moderate hand, designing a compromise that would endure far beyond her years. Under her careful guidance, the arts flourished. Playwrights penned immortal dramas, explorers charted distant shores, and merchants expanded trade winds that carried English ships to every corner of the known world. Her court was alive with music, poetry, and discourse, a celebration of intellect and ambition bound together by a shared love of country. Elizabeth's reign, lasting 45 years, brought stability and growth, allowing the nation to heal from the wounds of her predecessors' conflicts. With a cautious yet visionary approach, she balanced the demands of tradition and reform, forging an identity that would define England for centuries to come. Through these successive reigns, the boy king's earnest piety, Mary's fiery zeal, and Elizabeth's graceful compromise, the tapestry of Tudor England unfurled in vivid hues of triumph and tragedy. Yet the most enduring image remains that of Henry VIII, whose life bridged worlds of devotion and defiance, of opulence and decay. Those final days of his mortal struggle, marked by the pitiless advance of disease, the crumbling of his once formidable body, and the ignoble spectacle of his coffin's betrayal, stand as a stark reminder of human frailty. Indeed, no amount of gold or glory could shield him from the inexorable march of time. Historian Alison Weir once reflected upon this paradox with poignant clarity. It is one of the great ironies of history that a man endowed with such beauty, power, and ambition should end his days as a grotesque caricature of himself. These words ring with the weight of truth, for in Henry's end, we confront the stark reality that even the mightiest among us are subject to the same laws that govern every heartbeat and every breath. His story, woven through triumph and turmoil, legacy and lament, remains an eternal caution. That authority, however absolute, cannot conquer the immutable realms of flesh and destiny. Now, dear listener, as you drift towards slumber, let this tale settle around you like a velvet cloak. Remember the brass trumpets and the tapers at Windsor. Recall the silent prayer of a dying king's final grip, and picture the rise and fall of crowns that once gleamed as brightly as the morning Sunday. In the hush of your room, may the echoes of Tudor fate remind you that rest is granted to all, and that in the surrender to night's embrace, even the greatest of souls may find peace. After the state funeral concluded on the 16th of February in 1547, the royal court of England stepped slowly into a new chapter of uncertainty and transformation. Young Edward, the only son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, ascended to the throne at the tender age of 10, bearing the regal title of Edward VI. His accession was heralded by trumpets and banners, yet beneath the glittering pageantry lay a kingdom still reeling from the legacy of his father's tumultuous reign. Edward's early years as monarch were guided by powerful regents. First, the Duke of Somerset, a man of martial bearing who styled himself Lord Protector, and later the Duke of Northumberland, whose influence shifted like a shadow across the court. Under their stewardship, the realm continued along the path of Protestant reform that Henry had begun when he severed ties with Rome. Monasteries remained dissolved, parish churches were stripped of icons, and prayer books in the English tongue replaced the ancient Latin rites. Yet Edward himself, frail and scholarly, lacked both the strength of body and the experience of mind to wield true sovereignty. His lessons in divine right and governance took place within wood-panelled chambers under flickering candlelight, where tutors read to him passages from scripture and treatises on statecraft. Despite the earnest guidance of Somerset and Northumberland, Edward's health was as delicate as his youth was brief. He suffered persistent coughs, chills, and fevers that racked his slender frame. By the summer of 1553, after a mere 6 years upon the throne, the boy king succumbed to a grievous lung illness. Some say consumption. Others suspect a fever born of the damp palace corridors, and he breathed his last just before his 16th birthday. The young monarch's passing left England teetering on the brink of upheaval, for his short life had kindled hopes for a firmly Protestant kingdom, but had not yet laid deep roots. It was in this fragile interlude that Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, staked her claim to the crown. Proclaimed queen with solemn ceremony, she vowed to restore the ancient rites of the Roman Church upon English soil. Her earnest devotion to Catholicism, however sincere, soon hardened into a fierce campaign against those who clung to the new evangelical faith. Chronicles record the cruel tableau of burning stakes set alight in the chill wind, the acrid smoke rising against the leaden sky, as hundreds of Protestant preachers and lay believers met their end. Henceforth she would be remembered both by those who revered her and those who reviled her as Bloody Mary. Under Mary's rule, England appeared to turn backward, reintegrating with the authority of the Pope in Rome. Monasteries were reopened, masses sung in Latin once more, and the crucifix reclaimed its place above every altar. Yet her reign was not unchallenged. In 1554, whispers of rebellion coalesced into Wyatt's uprising, led by Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger, who decried the Queen's plan to wed her kinsman, the King of Spain, and decried the executions of the faithful. Though Mary's forces quashed the revolt, the tremors of dissent left the court on edge, and the countryside wary. Her zeal for religious uniformity sowed seeds of dissatisfaction among her subjects, for many feared the gallows more than they longed for lost traditions. Mary's own life was cut short by illness in 1558, at the age of 42. She died in the midst of winter, the damp chill mirroring the sombre mood of her people. Her death left the throne vacant once more, and with it, the burdens of a kingdom divided by faith. Into that breach stepped Elizabeth, the eldest daughter of Anne Boleyn, whose very name evoked memories of her mother's tragic fate. Elizabeth I ascended amid cautious celebration, her early years tempered by the knowledge that her father's anger and her half-brother's pursuers still haunted her family's legacy. Elizabeth's approach to governance was as deliberate as a soft tidal breath reaching the shore. She restored the Church of England with careful nuance, blending ancient tradition with reformed doctrine to create a national church that owed its loyalty to the crown rather than to foreign pontiffs. She crafted what became known as the Elizabethan settlement, a set of compromises designed to soothe the fierce rivalries between Protestants and Catholics. The Book of Common Prayer graced parish churches once more, yet the Mass remained absent, and clerical vestments were simplified in cut and colour. In this measured fashion, she sought to bind her subjects together, like threads of gold and silver woven into the tapestry of her realm. Beyond matters spiritual, Elizabeth devoted herself to strengthening the realm's defences and forging alliances that would keep England secure from external threats. She commissioned the construction and repair of coastal fortresses, expanded the Royal Navy with sturdy vessels that sliced through the Channel's waves, and authorised voyages to distant lands in search of trade and discovery. Under her watchful eye, Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe, returning with tales of foreign shores and the promise of new markets. Pirates and privateers, sanctioned by royal commission, harried Spanish treasure galleons, bolstering Elizabeth's coffers with golden bars and silver coins. Meanwhile, the arts blossomed as never before under the Queen's patronage. Playwrights penned dramas that would echo through the centuries, Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Jonson among them, while composers filled royal chapels with music that soared heavenward. Theatres sprang up in London's Bankside districts, drawing crowds to witness comedic jests and tragic romances. Under Elizabeth's prudent rule, the cultural landscape of England became rich and varied, a golden harvest after decades of religious strife. Her reign lasted nearly half a century, 45 years in total, during which the nation found a steady heartbeat beneath her calm demeanour. Elizabeth, though bearing the weight of her predecessors' legacies, remained steadfast in her resolve to maintain both internal harmony and external respect. She avoided costly continental wars, preferring diplomacy and espionage to open conflict, and only once did England face the storm of invasion, when the Spanish Armada thundered upon the Channel's waters. There, under Elizabeth's watchful gaze and the skill of her captains, the mighty fleet was scattered, its wooden hulls shattered against the tide. Thus, the destinies of the three monarchs who followed Henry VIII's momentous reign, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, reflect the profound shifts in 16th century England. The boy king bore the torch of reform but flickered out too soon. Mary embraced ancient faith with a fierce hand, but ignited fear and discontent. And Elizabeth, with patient skill, wove a tapestry of compromise that held her kingdom together and ushered in an age of exploration, culture, and relative peace. Each in turn inherited the burdens and the triumphs of the Tudor name, forging a legacy as mutable and unpredictable as the very winds that shaped the tides. In their stories we find the echo of a realm forever poised between the altar and the sword, between innovation and tradition, guided always by the will and the mortal frailty of those who wore the crown. Imagine a gentle hush falling over the pages of history as we pause to contemplate the final, tragic lesson left by Henry VIII's descent into decay. Though he once strode across England's green fields with the assured gait of a Renaissance prince, his rich attire gleaming in the sunlight, his presence commanding and absolute, he ultimately found himself undone by his own frailty. This was a monarch who dared to stand above the law, who severed his realm from the authority of the Pope, who reshaped the very soul of his nation at the flick of a pen and the clang of a sword. And yet, in the quiet chambers of his final days, none of that power could spare him from the ravages of his diseased flesh. His body, once sculpted by youth and athleticism, grew vast and unwieldy, swollen by the cruelties of gout and the neglect of healthier habits. The ulcer on his right leg festered without mercy, a grotesque emblem of physical collapse that no blacksmith's iron or apothecary's poison could seal. Pain lanced through him as though the gods themselves had seized his bones, leaving him to howl his anguish into the stillness of candlelit corridors. Paranoia coiled around his thoughts like a serpent, convincing him that traitors lurked in every shadow, plotting his downfall. Thus, the mighty Henry, whose word had once been law and whose will had shaped the destiny of millions, became the living embodiment of human limitation. An unassailable fortress brought low by forces no mortal could command. Historian Alison Weir captured this paradox with haunting clarity. It is one of the great ironies of history that a man endowed with beauty, power, and vision should end his days as a grotesque caricature of himself, tormented by body and mind, surrounded by sycophants and fear, yet rarely truly loved. In these words, we find a mirror held up to the contradictions of Henry's life. He was both tyrant and victim, author of sweeping reforms, and prisoner of his own ambitions. His endless thirst for authority led him to reshape church and state alike, yet he could not extend that dominion over his own body. Consider, for a moment, the portraits that still hang in ancient galleries. Henry VIII, resplendent in royal robes of scarlet and ermine, sword at his side, eyes unabashedly proud. Contrast those images with the whispered tales of his final months, when he lay prostrate on his bed, inflamed sores that wept unclean liquids, his breath fetid and ragged. There, under his sumptuous cushions and beneath layers of velvet, he convulsed with pain, wretched in agony, and sobbed for mercy to ears that could offer none. Such a chasm between outward majesty and private decay warns all who would don a mantle of absolute power. No crown, however brilliant, can conceal the reality of a mortal frame. Yet the story does not end with a single moral of bodily humility. There is a second lesson, one drawn from the turbulent politics that Henry unleashed. His bold withdrawal from papal authority and the establishment of the Church of England energized religious reformation, setting in motion a transformation whose effects would resonate for centuries. Monks' choirs fell silent, abbeys lay abandoned, and new doctrines spread like wildfire across fields and villages. In time, these changes formed the very bedrock of Anglican identity, blending ancient liturgy with reformed scripture in a uniquely English synthesis. But let us not overlook the price paid in blood and uncertainty. Henry's single-minded imposition of reform came at the cost of monasteries dissolved, convents closed, and the livelihoods of those who had served God in cloistered silence. Peasants, once sheltered by the Church's charity, found themselves adrift and impoverished. Nobles who clung to old allegiances were stripped of lands and titles, their families cast out in the harsh glare of royal decree. The fabric of English society, torn and reknit in a single reign, bore the scars of conflict and displacement. Families fractured, long-standing bonds of fealty unravelled, and a tempest of religious tension brewed that would not settle until the reign of Elizabeth, Henry's own daughter, ushered in a fragile equilibrium. Indeed, the story of Henry VIII reminds us that even the noblest reforms require a measure of compassion and a willingness to listen. Sweeping edicts, imposed without regard for the suffering they cause, can sow as much discord as unity. True transformation grows from the soil of dialogue and understanding, not from the blade that severs tradition by force. It is a lesson as relevant today as it was in Tudor England, that power must be tempered by empathy, and that progress, to endure, must be inclusive. So as you drift closer to sleep, let the final echoes of Henry's life settle softly around you. Recall a king who reshaped his kingdom with a flourish, yet found himself undone by wounds no edict could heal. Remember his towering stature, eclipsed by the very body that had once borne him so triumphantly. Recall the galleries of saints and scholars he inspired to create music and art, and the ruins of abbeys emptied in his fervour to renew the realm. Allow your thoughts to linger on Alison Weir's words, and let them remind you that our greatest strengths may become our greatest vulnerabilities. May you find in this tale a gentle reassurance that even the mightiest must someday yield to the quiet gravity of our shared humanity. And in that yielding may you discover the peace of night's embrace, where crowns are laid to rest and all souls, great and small, find their equal solace in the softest breath of dawn. Beneath the gilt and grandeur of Tudor courts lies a more somber tale, one that, through the lens of modern medicine, reveals the tragic cascade of harm wrought by misapplied treatments and an unhealthy lifestyle. It was that fateful fall at Greenwich in the winter of 1536 that marked the beginning of Henry VIII's inexorable decline. Contemporary physicians, viewing his 2-hour unconsciousness as a mere concussion, failed to recognize the subtle yet profound damage inflicted upon his brain. Today, experts surmise that Henry likely suffered mild strokes or traumatic brain injury events that, though hidden from the record of his day, would have altered the chemistry of his mind. The result was a marked shift in his demeanor. Bouts of explosive rage, spirals of paranoia, and draconian edicts that echoed the frenzy within his damaged skull. At the same time, the ulcer on his right leg, once a painful annoyance, evolved into a chronic, life-threatening wound. Lacking antiseptics or antibiotics, 16th century medicine could do little beyond cauterizing the wound with searing irons, a practice that drove pain ever deeper into his bones. Bloodletting, once considered a panacea, drained him of vital strength, leaving him faint and disoriented. Remedies that employed arsenic and mercury poisons, masquerading as cures, further debased his health, leaching away resilience like a slow, merciless tide. Today, we look upon these practices as surgical errors and toxic misadventures, a stark reminder that even the most well-intentioned interventions can yield devastation when unmoored from knowledge. Yet the mess of his body was only half the story. Henry's diet became a crucible of self-inflicted peril. Royal records speak of feasts averaging 5,000 calories a day, mountains of red meat roasted and stewed, plates of savory pies bursting with fatty fillings, and flagons of wine and ale passed from hand to hand in endless procession. Vegetables, those humble guardians of health, were a rarity, thought unworthy of a king's table. The result was a body both engorged and fragile, obese beyond measure, with a waist that more than doubled in girth from the trim figure of his youth. In modern terms, he likely grappled with type 2 diabetes, its silent metabolic fury compounding the venom of his other ailments. Hypertension and heart failure loomed as constant threats, while the crystals of gout that lodged in his joints sparked fires of agony with each movement. Imagine, if you will, that final twilight of regal abundance turned terror. A wealthy banquet hall, walls alive with flickering candlelight, tables groaning under the weight of roast boar and venison, spiced sauces, and shimmering goblets, yet the man who presided over it all could taste nothing. Each morsel became a potential vector for death, each sip of wine a whispered threat of slow suicide. The irony of it rends the heart. Those very feasts that once proclaimed his dominance now lay before him as instruments of dread. The cutlery, once gleaming symbols of royal privilege, underwent rigorous purification, scrubbed and scalded, until the silver shone like a beacon, lest any poison lurk upon its surface. Drinks passed only after a confidant nibbled and sipped, sacrificing his own safety to the king's delusion. This system of gastronomic security, conceived in fear of the dagger and the cup, offered no solace. Hour after hour, as courtiers watched with bated breath, the king's trembling lips pressed to plate and chalice, only to recoil in revulsion or remain unmoved by flavour. A single crumb of bread might mean survival or swift oblivion, and so each meal became an ordeal, a trial of trust that eroded both his strength and the faith of those who served him. Those quiet nightmares of solitary dining when the torches sputtered low and the echo of distant laughter felt like mockery underscored the bitter truth. In the twilight of absolute power, even sustenance can turn murderous. Viewed from our vantage, Henry VIII's end stands as both a medical cautionary tale and a moral parable. His brain, once a font of ambition and charisma, was rent by injury and inflamed by deceitful cures. His body, once a fortress of physical prowess, buckled beneath the weight of opulence and error. His table, a stage for lavish spectacle, became a gauntlet of fear. The convergence of these factors, each amplifying the other, fashioned a grotesque theatre of suffering, one that echoed through Tudor corridors and now resonates across the centuries. So, as you drift ever closer to sleep's gentle shores, let this sombre account remind you that our bodies, however robust, harbour the delicacy of glass. Medical interventions, when blind to the hidden currents of physiology, may wound rather than heal. Riches, when consumed without moderation, may hasten our undoing. And the very symbols of authority, when corrupted by fear, may become instruments of our undoing. Allow your thoughts to settle upon this paradox, that the most feared and venerated ruler of a great realm could be brought low by wounds unseen and sustenance once lauded. And in that reflection, find the quiet wisdom that even kings must yield to the laws of nature, and that in the surrender to rest, we all find our truest equality. May these thoughts guide you into slumber, where power wanes and every crown, every fear dissolves into the hush of night. The death of Henry VIII sent ripples through English society that reached far beyond the cold stones of Windsor Castle. His passing marked not only the end of an individual life, but also the unravelling of centuries of tradition under the Roman Church. Only a few years earlier, the royal court had echoed with the solemn Latin chants of Mass, and the ancient tapestries depicting the saints had hung heavy upon the walls of cathedrals and great halls. Now, with the king gone, those same spaces fell silent, or were repurposed to suit the new order. Monasteries once brimming with monks in prayer stood abandoned, or were turned into granaries and private estates. Parishioners, accustomed to kneeling for the old rites, found themselves confronted with vernacular prayer books and simplified liturgies that emphasized scripture over ceremony. This sweeping transformation of religious life did more than alter the way people worshipped. It reshaped the very fabric of community. Villagers who had relied on the abbey for charity found themselves adrift, forced to seek new sources of alms and assistance. Pilgrimages to holy shrines, once a cornerstone of popular devotion, fell away as those sites lost their official sanction. Even the guilds and fraternities that had grown up around the brotherhoods of the church had to forge new identities or dissolve into uncertainty. As the spiritual centre of gravity shifted away from Rome toward a consummately English church, the English people faced a crisis of faith unlike any in living memory. Some embraced the change with relief, glad that they could read prayers in their own tongue. Others mourned the loss of centuries, old traditions, convinced that something essential had been lost forever. In the realm of literature and art, the decay of Henry's body became more than whispered gossip among courtiers. It became a symbol, a poignant motif for writers and painters grappling with the impermanence of power. Poets of the Tudor age, their quills dipped in ink and tempered by candlelight, scribbled lines that compared the bloated king to fallen idols, lamenting how even the mightiest must bow to time's inexorable march. Tragic playwrights, performing in the winding lanes of London, wove references to the king's open sores and staggering bulk into their narratives, using those vivid images to underscore themes of hubris and downfall. Painters, too, turned their brushes to more sombre palettes, capturing the grotesque beauty of decay in portraits that juxtaposed regal finery with signs of mortality, a cracked glove, a pallid cheek, a silent wound revealed at the ankle. These works reminded audiences, night after night in taverns and courts, that no crown, however lustrous, could halt the slow entropy of flesh. The political aftermath of Henry's passing proved equally profound. His decision to establish a separate Church of England, born from a personal quest for a male heir, would shape the destinies of monarchs and subjects alike for generations. Though his motives were often judged self-serving, the long-term consequence was a national church that owed allegiance to the English crown rather than to a distant pontiff. This newfound ecclesiastical sovereignty provided Elizabeth I, his daughter, with a sturdy platform on which to build a more moderate and enduring settlement. Under her guidance, the Church of England found a balance between tradition and innovation, incorporating elements of Catholic ceremony alongside Protestant preaching. That compromise helped to stabilize a realm torn by sectarian strife and allowed English culture to flourish in a remarkably productive era. Yet the foundation of Anglican independence was laid at a steep price. The dissolution of monasteries enriched the crown and a new gentry class, but it also dispossessed countless monks and nuns, thrusting them into poverty and uncertainty. The king's dissolution edicts left a swath of abandoned cloisters and shuttered chapels across the countryside, their stones repurposed for manor houses and town walls. More grievously, the religious policies that followed Henry's death unleashed a torrent of executions and reprisals. Under his daughter Mary I herself, a direct inheritor of Henry's volatile legacy, Hundreds of Protestant preachers and lay adherents were condemned to the stake in gruesome public spectacles. These burnings, carried out in towns from London to Coventry, seared the collective memory of a nation, fostering bitterness that would endure even after Queen Mary's death. Equally tragic was the fate of Anne Boleyn, Henry's beheaded second wife, whose execution for alleged treason and adultery left her children. Most notably, Elizabeth poised precariously between royal favour and disgrace. Anne's downfall served as a cautionary tale etched in the popular imagination. A woman who dared to rise in power could fall in a heartbeat, her name stripped from chronicles, her likeness defaced from portraiture. Elizabeth endured years of uncertainty and imprisonment, her very existence a testament to the volatile whims of royal favour. Yet it was she who ultimately harnessed the Anglican inheritance to guide England into its golden age, transforming her mother's shadow into a beacon of stability. Thus, the echo of Henry VIII's ghastly demise extends far beyond the deathbed agonies and leaking coffins. It resonates in the haunted ruins of abbeys consumed by ivy, in the doggerel verses that lament the perils of human pride, and in the statutes that granted a monarch supreme authority over church and state. His story reminds us that the most seismic shifts in history can spring from the most personal of desires, be it a yearning for a male heir or a craving for medical cures. And it teaches that every bold stroke of reform must contend with the human cost it exacts. The families broken, the faiths contested, the lives extinguished in the name of progress. So, as you drift into the gentle arms of sleep, let this complex legacy of Henry VIII settle around you like the quiet hush of twilight. Recall the towering figure who once bent the course of nations, now depicted in art as a figure both grand and grotesque. Picture the abbey gates swinging silently in deserted cloisters, the parishes learning new prayers in their own tongue, and the people whispering of flames and martyrs. And remember that power, in its most absolute form, can both create and destroy, often in the same breath. May these reflections guide you into dreams where time's relentless tides recede, and where even the weightiest of crowns can be laid down in peace. Imagine yourself drifting on a gentle current of thought as we contemplate the final, profound lesson woven into the tragic tapestry of Henry VIII's demise. In his life, he wielded absolute power, sweeping away ancient church laws, severing ties with Rome, and commanding armies with the flick of a royal hand. Yet, when illness laid its relentless grip upon him, none of that majestic authority could shield him from the immutable laws of nature. No fortress walls, no finely wrought crown, no horde of loyal subjects could stave off the slow, insidious march of aging, disease, and death. The story of Henry's end serves as an enduring reminder. The mightiest rulers, no matter how resplendent, must ultimately bow to the same natural order as all living creatures. And in that humbling reckoning, we find a universal truth. True power, when untethered from compassion and the pursuit of knowledge, risks transforming into a ceaseless nightmare, one where cruelty and fear eclipse the very ideals that authority should protect. Observe the haunting contrast between the gilded portraits that immortalize Henry in all his regal splendor and the ghastly reality of his final hours, when his bloated form lay racked with pain in a dim bedchamber, and the miasma of decay clung to each velvet curtain. Those portraits, rich with gold leaf, sumptuous robes, and defiant gazes, speak of a prince who revelled in his own grandeur. Yet not long after, the same body would be carried on a bier to Street, George's Chapel, its casket leaking fetid fluids that drew stray dogs to their ignoble feast. That stark juxtaposition between the shining crown and the ravaged corpse becomes a potent metaphor for human existence. The bright illusion of unassailable grandeur is always fragile, undone by the relentless reality of flesh. Henry forged his legacy through bold reforms, redefined the religious landscape of England, and conducted grand diplomatic maneuvers with France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. Yet in the end, his flesh betrayed him. His mind was clouded by injury and fear, and the echoes of his once commanding presence faded into whispered tales of agony and fright. From his final struggle emerges a second, equally vital lesson in leadership and governance. Reform can be an awe-inspiring force for progress, reshaping societies and liberating minds, but it must be guided by empathy and respect for human dignity. Henry VIII's decision to dissolve monasteries and impose a new national church was driven in part by a desperate yearning for a male heir. Yet the methods he employed, confiscating ecclesiastical lands, dispossessing communities, and enforcing religious change with the harshness of sword and statute, sowed seeds of bitterness and strife that would blossom into decades of sectarian violence. Under Mary Tudor, the violent suppression of Protestant dissent scorched the realm with the moniker Bloody Mary, while under Elizabeth I, careful compromise brought a fragile peace, but could not entirely erase the memory of bonfires and shattered families. Thus, we learn that even the most magnificent reform can unleash long shadows if it marches forward without listening to the voices of those it uproots. Genuine progress, to endure, must balance bold vision with compassion, showing deference to the humanity of every individual. And now, as the last embers of our meditation glow softly within your thoughts, let the tragedy of Henry VIII's twilight years echo as a universal mandate. None of us can stand beyond the cycle of birth, aging, sickness, and death. Even at the apex of power, when every subject bowed and every decree rang with finality, Henry existed within the immutable confines of mortal flesh. His body weakened, his mind troubled, and his empire rippled with unrest. He became a living parable of human fragility. In his ultimate fall from exalted heights, we recognize our own fleeting place within the vast expanse of time and nature. We find solace in the thought that power's brilliance, however dazzling, will one day fade, leaving behind only the quiet truth of our shared mortality. So, as your eyelids grow heavy and the night air murmurs its lullaby, imagine that final scene: a colossal king laid low, his bed a cradle of suffering, the casket that bore him a vessel of ignominy, and the silent chapel awaiting the hush of dawn. In that stillness, we glimpse not only the end of a monarch, but the universal destiny that binds every life to the ebb and flow of existence. Rest, then, in the gentle embrace of sleep, where titles and gold yield to the quiet dignity of human vulnerability, and where, for all of us, the crown at last dissolves into the soft shadows of night. In the quiet hush of candlelit halls, one might not guess that Henry VIII's court was a whirlwind of diplomatic manoeuvring, each treaty and alliance another piece on the grand chessboard of 16th century Europe. From the moment he claimed the crown, Henry sought to balance the power of France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, as though they were celestial bodies he might align to suit his ambitions. In his early years, he maintained cordial ties with France, inviting French envoys to sumptuous banquets that draped long tables in velvet cloths and sparkled with crystal goblets of fine wine. Yet beneath the polite toasts lay Henry's unspoken aim: to secure England's influence on the continent and ensure that no single power could overshadow his own kingdom. As the seasons turned, Henry shifted his gaze toward Madrid and Rome. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Emperor Charles V, opened a channel of favor in the imperial court. For a time, this alliance brought temporary religious and military advantages. Spanish troops conducted joint maneuvers with English levies, and Catholic support stood ready to counterbalance French ambitions. But alliances proved as fickle as the winds themselves. When disputes over territory and protocols surfaced, Henry turned on his imperial ally with the same surety he had embraced him, forging treaties anew with the very monarch he had once opposed. In one year, English banners flew beside French fleur-de-lis on the battlefield. The next, they rallied against Paris to contain the emperor. This policy of marry one power to bind another fetched England generous subsidies and hardened her reputation as a shrewd arbiter among the great houses of Europe. Yet the cost weighed heavily on the royal coffers. Each campaign required fresh fleets, new armour, endless provisions expenses that depleted the treasury as swiftly as rain fills a parched stream. To refill the vaults, Henry turned upon the monasteries that dotted the English countryside. He dissolved their holdings in a sweeping reform that confiscated vast tracts of land and redistributed wealth to loyal supporters. Church lands, once the domain of silent orders of monks and nuns, now passed into private hands, bolstering his financial base and reinforcing his personal authority. With the proceeds, he raised revenues, funded further military endeavours, and cemented his power in stone and coin. But these grand strategies did not unfold in isolation from the common people. The relentless drumbeat of war and taxation sent the price of grain soaring, turning the humble loaf into a luxury for many. In 1536, a wave of unrest, later called the Pilgrimage of Grace, or the Peasants' Revolt, erupted in Yorkshire and across northern shires, as thousands rose in protest against new levies and the suppression of their traditional religious practices. The king's soldiers, disciplined and well-equipped, descended upon the insurgents with frightening efficiency. Cannon boomed across open fields, and marauding bands of cavalry scattered villagers who dared resist. With the revolt crushed, Henry's forces restored order through fear and force. Yet the embers of resentment smouldered beneath the surface, a quiet testament to the suffering endured. Amid these tumults of war and unrest, Henry's vision for a strong navy began to take concrete form. Recognizing that England's future lay not only in the strength of her armies but also in the mastery of her seas, he commissioned the construction of new warships, sturdy vessels bristling with cannon, and rigged to withstand the Channel's capricious storms. He improved the defences of Portsmouth and Plymouth, ensuring that the fleets could sail forth or retreat to secure harbours when needed. Over time, these investments bore fruit. English ships patrolled the Channel with growing confidence, deterring enemy fleets and protecting vital trade routes. By the time of his daughter Elizabeth's reign, the foundations laid by Henry would bloom into the renowned English naval power that challenged Spain's armada and opened the way for global exploration. Yet Henry's legacy was not defined by steel and gunpowder alone. In the sanctuary of the Chapel Royal, and beneath the vaulted arches of St. George's Chapel, a different kind of brilliance took shape. Under his patronage, the first golden age of English sacred music dawned. Composers like Thomas Tallis and William Byrd blended the soaring polyphony of the continent with the clarity of English verse, creating anthems that seemed to reverberate with the very heartbeat of God's grace. By candlelight, choirs rehearsed intricate motets, their voices weaving ribbons of sound that filled every stone niche with loving devotion. Meanwhile, in the bright studios of court painters, Hans Holbein and Lucas Cranach lent their unmatched skill to record the faces of the king, his queens, and the dignitaries who surrounded him. Each portrait, meticulously detailed, captured not only the fine velvet collars and jeweled necklaces, but also the distinct character of each subject. These artworks, born of a realm newly liberated from the strictures of Rome, laid the cornerstones for an independent English cultural renaissance. And yet, for all these triumphs in diplomacy, military innovation, and the arts, a darker undercurrent lay just beneath the surface of Henry's court. His decisions to arrest and execute beloved nobleman figures like the Duke of Norfolk and Thomas Cromwell cast a pall of fear over the palace. No one could predict where the king's suspicion might fall next, and whispered gossip of treasonous plots became a grim pastime of the courtiers. The very instruments of creativity, scribe and canvas, choir and choirboy, shared space with the hangman's block and the prison cell, forging a Tudor identity both magnificent and macabre. Thus, the reign of Henry VIII emerges in our minds as a time of exhilarating paradox. Grand alliances spun like threads on the loom of Europe, only to be cut and rewoven with equal swiftness. A peasants' revolt quelled as swiftly as it was ignited. A navy born from necessity and destined for glory. A flowering of music and portraiture, even as fear stalked the corridors. The Tudor tapestry shimmered with splendour, yet every stitch bore the tension of violence and the price of power. Now, as your eyes grow heavy and the hush of night deepens, let this tale settle around you like the slow unfurling of a long-forgotten banner. Feel the echo of marching soldiers give way to the soft flutter of choral robes, and let the image of grand ships slip into the calm of dream-filled waters. In this gentle crossing into sleep, may the complex legacy of Henry VIII, his strategic brilliance, his cultural patronage, and his ruthless fervour fade softly into the starry fabric of history, leaving you with the peaceful knowledge that even the grandest reigns must yield to the quiet grace of rest. Over the course of his reign, Henry VIII discovered that the price of absolute power was far steeper than he had ever imagined. His decisions had cost countless lives, be they wives condemned on dubious charges or loyal counsellors executed for alleged betrayal, and yet those were merely the external toll. Hidden beneath sumptuous robes and gilded crowns lay a deeper exhaustion, a wearing away of the spirit itself. Many modern scholars now believe that the violent concussion he suffered when his mount collapsed in 1536 fractured the very regions of his brain that govern reason and restraint. Without the benefit of contemporary neuroscience, his physicians treated only the surface wounds, unaware of the subtle damage that twisted his emotions into quicksilver fury and sharpened his instincts into a blade of suspicion. In the years that followed, random outbursts of rage erupted like storms in his chambers, and whispers of conspiracy haunted him in every dark corner. His growing bulk, swelled by an indulgent diet, heavy in red meats and sweet wines, only compounded his suffering. Obesity, relentless gout, and chronic infections robbed him of restful slumber, leaving him to drift through half-sleep nights where pain held him in a merciless grip. In those long hours of wakefulness, he sought refuge in spirits distilled from grain and fruit, perhaps hoping that a draught of strong liquor might dull the agony that throbbed in his leg or quell the gnawing loneliness that crept through his mind. The flask became a constant companion at his bedside, its contents both a balm and a curse, offering fleeting relief, even as they stoked the fires of indigestion and inflamed the gout that racked his joints. Contemporary accounts paint haunting pictures of Henry's sleepless vigils. He would lie alert in the dead of night, straining to catch the soft footfalls of sentries pacing the corridor outside, convinced that a dagger might flash through a curtain at any moment. When the delirium of pain overcame him, he would moan and cry out, his voice echoing against stone walls like a wounded animal's plea. Courtiers who once stood shoulder to shoulder with him in battle now hovered at his chamber door, uncertain whether to bow deeply in loyalty or to keep their distance from the stench of decay that lingered on his sheets. In such moments, power offered him no comfort, and the walls of the palace seemed to contract around his bed as though he were a prisoner condemned by his own ambitions. Yet another sorrow lay in the shifting fates of his children, heirs to a legacy as fraught as the kingdom itself. Edward, his firstborn son by Jane Seymour, inherited not only the throne but also the fervour for Protestant reform. Under the guidance of stern regents, the boy king embraced his faith with devout intensity, yet his tender years and failing health allowed little time for true mastery of statecraft. When he died, scarcely past his 15th year, his passing left a vacuum that would be filled by his half-sister Mary. Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, ascended with a determination to restore Catholicism in full. Yet her zeal carried with it the torch of persecution, igniting fresh flames of religious conflict. The realm trembled under her convictions, even as she too faced the isolation of sovereign authority, surrounded by courtiers fearful of her next decree. Finally, upon Mary's death, it was Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, who would seize the reins of power. With shrewd grace, Elizabeth wove a delicate tapestry of compromise, blending Protestant and Catholic elements into the fabric of the Church of England. She learned from her siblings' misfortunes and from the fierce ambitions of her father, tempering reform with tolerance. Yet she inherited wounds still raw from the years of turmoil, the bitter memory of burned martyrs and the divisions sown by her father's break with Rome. As Elizabeth guided the kingdom for nearly half a century, she too sometimes stood alone in her privy chambers, weighed down by the burdens of succession and remembrance. Viewed through the lens of human experience, Henry VIII's final years reveal a monarch caught in the solitary vortex of absolute power. The more he endeavoured to shape his world through acts of law and execution, the more he found himself ensnared by the limitations of his own mind and body. No decree could repair his fractured skull. No edict could staunch the flow of miasma from his festering wounds. His court, once alive with the excitement of courtly brilliance, became a place of hushed footsteps and furtive glances, as if those around him feared both his judgment and the deadly scent that clung to his presence. In the end, Henry could not escape the fate common to all mortals. Surrounded by riches, titles, and the instruments of his own making, he faced his final hours in isolation, distanced as much by his suffering as by the grandeur he once commanded. His deathbed was not a scene of triumphant legacy, but a stark tableau of human frailty, where the clang of armour and the flourish of languages gave way to ragged breaths and whispered prayers. As you drift into the gentle embrace of sleep, let this chapter of Henry VIII's life settle softly in your thoughts. Recall that even the mightiest among us may find themselves alone in the quiet darkness, awaiting the release that rest and, ultimately, death bring to every weary soul. May these reflections guide you into dreams where power and pain are but distant echoes, and where the chamber of sleep offers its own peaceful sovereignty. Compared to his contemporary monarchs, Henry VIII stands out in striking contrast. While kings of France engaged wholeheartedly in elaborate religious ceremonies and mounted grand military campaigns with bodies fortified by youth, few suffered the prolonged physical collapse that haunted the English sovereign. Across Europe, chronicles tell of Louis XII and Francis I leading their armies on horseback through sunlit fields, their vigour seemingly boundless. Yet Henry, in the autumn of his life, found himself unable even to rise from bed without assistance, slipping into a specially constructed wheeled chair that bore him through archways he could no longer navigate on foot. Each movement sent waves of agony rippling through his scarred leg, the pain slicing through him like a hot knife pressed against tender flesh. Viewed through the lens of modern medicine, Henry VIII's condition reveals a tragic intersection of multiple chronic illnesses and a traumatic brain injury. His famous jousting accident at Greenwich, which left him unconscious for some 2 hours, likely caused damage to his frontal lobes, the regions responsible for emotional regulation and rational thought. Contemporary psychiatrists speculate that this kind of trauma can precipitate what is known today as Korsakoff syndrome, characterized by short-term memory loss, confabulation, and paranoid delusions. In Henry's later years, such symptoms manifested as sudden rages and profound mistrust of those around him, prompting him to issue edicts that alternately celebrated his brilliance and punished imaginary conspiracies. This neurological turmoil blended dangerously with the physical ailments that beset him. His once athletic frame ballooned under a diet of rich meats, pies, and copious draughts of sweet wine and ale. Obesity magnified his gout, turning each step into a fiery ordeal, while his gout raged unchecked by any effective treatments. His heart laboured under the strain of excessive weight and high blood pressure, though these terms lay centuries in the future, declaring the body to be at war with itself. Within the dimly lit walls of Whitehall, doctors performed bloodletting and applied cauterization with heated irons, believing these brutal measures to be remedies, when in fact they only drained his vitality further and fanned the flames of infection. All the while, Henry laboured under a deep, gnawing loneliness that no amount of lavish pageantry could dispel. His bedchamber became both sanctuary and prison, the elegant canopied curtains offering only an illusion of comfort against the stench of his festering wounds. When pain kept him lucid through the long nights, he would quietly dread the footsteps of his guard, imagining poison or assassination in every whispered knock. Yet, even as he fortified his meals with layers of precaution, having trusted servants taste each dish before it touched his lips, the betrayal he feared most was the betrayal of his own weakened flesh. In the annals of Elizabethan psychology, historians note that head trauma of this kind can trigger dramatic shifts in personality. A once generous ruler transformed into a despot driven by paranoia, wielding the mechanisms of law and punishment as blunt instruments against perceived foes. Thus, Henry VIII, who had once championed chivalric ideals, found himself sanctioning mass arrests, orchestrating trials that courted scandal, and ordering executions that stained the blade of his sword with the tears of kin and counsel alike. Yet these harsh measures did little to ease the prince's inner turmoil, for the same stroke of fate that made him may have left his mind forever suspect of kindness. From a literary standpoint, Henry's tragic decline resonated deeply in the works of his successors. Though William Shakespeare never wrote a play specifically about Henry VIII, perhaps out of respect for Elizabeth I's lineage, he wove echoes of the fallen king's hubris and vulnerability into his histories. In Henry V, one finds not only the stirring oratory on the fields of Agincourt, but also the haunting reminder that no victory on the battlefield can shield a ruler from the ravages of age and illness. Elizabethan dramatists often invoke the image of a rotting corpse or the telltale tang of decay in their tragedies, cautioning audiences that flesh, regardless of station, is destined to fail. These allusions served as moral commentaries on the transience of power, urging spectators to temper ambition with humility. Beyond the sphere of politics and drama, Henry VIII's reign reshaped the social landscape of England in ways that endure to this day. His dissolution of the monasteries, driven by both political expediency and an eagerness to amass wealth, released a vast amount of property into the hands of the crown. Those lands, once tended by monks and used for charitable works, were sold off to rising nobles and merchants who had the means to purchase them. In this way, a new class of landowners emerged, a proto-gentry whose fortunes were rooted not in ancient lineage but in shrewd acquisition and agricultural management. These men, invested in the productivity of their estates, introduced innovations in crop rotation and enclosure that would, over the following centuries, kindle the fires of Britain's agrarian and eventual industrial revolutions. Thus, even as Henry's religious reforms sowed discord and his personal excesses invited scandal, he unwittingly planted seeds for a more dynamic socio-economic order. The wealth of the monasteries, redistributed into the hands of a broader slice of society, generated capital that could be reinvested in commerce, manufacturing, and new enterprises. This nascent capitalist ethos found its roots in the Tudor husbandry that prioritized efficiency and productivity, setting in motion a transformation that would shape the character of the English countryside and its emerging market towns. Yet it is impossible to celebrate these developments without acknowledging the costs in human suffering and cultural upheaval. Monks and nuns, once integral to community life, were displaced and rendered homeless. Pilgrimages to holy shrines at Walsingham or Canterbury dwindled as the priories that maintained them crumbled into silence. And the new landed class, though instrumental in economic growth, also propelled the enclosure movement that would marginalize many peasants, prompting waves of migration to burgeoning towns and, in time, contributing to the social tensions of the 17th century. At the end of the story of King Henry VIII, many may feel a chill and a sense of lingering unease. Yet behind this horrific tale of bodily and spiritual decay lie profound lessons that transcend historical boundaries and speak directly to our modern lives. First, this story is a powerful reminder of the fragility of power and outward appearances. Henry VIII built his empire on absolute authority, personal beauty, and physical strength. He believed he could reshape an entire nation and defy human laws. Yet in the end, he fell victim to the basic laws of nature: aging, illness, and death. The lesson here is that no matter our status, power, or wealth, we all face the limits of our own bodies. We must cherish our health and not allow blind ambition to overwhelm us, because ultimately, our body is the most precious asset we possess. Second, Henry's story shows the terrifying consequences of arrogance and a lack of self-control. His excessive diet and unscientific lifestyle directly accelerated his decline. In our modern world, with advances in medicine, we have more knowledge than ever about the importance of a healthy lifestyle. Henry VIII's life serves as a stark warning that self-care is not merely an option but a responsibility. Discipline in diet, exercise, and emotional regulation can help us avoid tragic health crises. Third, this narrative speaks to the corrupting influence of unchecked power. At the height of his authority, Henry's paranoia drove him to brutal decisions, ending the lives of many close and loyal companions. This illustrates how absolute power can warp a person's character, isolating and terrifying them. It reminds us that power holds value only when accompanied by responsibility, compassion, and clarity of mind. When power becomes an end in itself, it inevitably brings destruction not only to the wielder, but also to those around them. Finally, Henry VIII's life carries a message about compassion and tolerance. Although he was a ruthless king, it was the devoted care of his last wife, Catherine Parr, that showed us how humanity can endure even in the darkest moments. Her kindness reminds us that empathy and understanding never lose their meaning, even when we face difficult circumstances or imperfect people. This story stands as a vivid, symbolic chronicle of the impermanence of power and the immutable laws of nature. It reminds us that at life's end, we are all equal before death, regardless of our achievements or social standing. Thank you all for accompanying me through tonight's tale. I hope these reflections have offered you a new perspective on history, one that is both chilling and rich with valuable lessons. If you are still awake, I wish you a peaceful night and the sweetest of dreams. If you are ready to sleep, may you enjoy a deep and restful slumber. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our newest and most compelling stories. Until next time,